Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us this afternoon. My name's Jo Inchley, and I'm the Director of the Triumph Network based at the MRC CSO Social and Public Health Sciences Unit at the University of Glasgow. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here on behalf of the Triumph Network to the webinar this afternoon, looking at understanding and preventing youth suicide, transdisciplinary perspectives. So this is such an important and challenging issue, as we all know, and particularly perhaps in the context of increasing mental health concerns amongst young people today. And we know that for many young people, that may have been exacerbated by the COVID pandemic as well. So the Triumph Network is one of 8 UKRI-funded mental health networks across the UK, and it aims to bring together academics, practitioners, policymakers, and young people themselves to consider the key challenges for youth public mental health today, and together to try and identify potential new ways to address these challenges. Young people are at the heart of what we do in Triumph, and I'm delighted to have Isla and Sam from our Youth Advisory Group taking part in the webinar this afternoon to share their views and experiences. And we have a fantastic lineup of speakers as well from across policy, practice, and academia to give those transdisciplinary perspectives. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Lynn Gilmore, who's our Triumph Network Coordinator, to tell you a little bit more about the format of the day and to introduce our speakers to you.
As Jo said, we're delighted to have a range of speakers with us this afternoon from a variety of different backgrounds and giving us some really different perspectives on this issue. So first up, we have Siobhan O'Neill, who is a Professor of Mental Health Sciences at Ulster University and the Interim Mental Health Champion for Northern Ireland. Her research programmes focus on trauma, mental illness and suicidal behaviour in Northern Ireland and the transgenerational transmission of trauma. The transgenerational transmission of trauma. Trying to say that after a glass of wine. She is now on a mission at the Mental Health Champion to improve the mental health of people in Northern Ireland by promoting evidence-based services and care for those who suffer mental illness and suicidal thoughts. Then we have Lauren Burke. Hi, Lauren, who is Team Manager for Childline in Glasgow. Lauren has worked with Childline since 2017 and has been a volunteer counsellor there for 2 years before this. Hazel Marzetti is joining us from the University of Edinburgh, where she is a research associate on the Suicide in as Politics project, which is funded by the Leverhulme Trust. So today, Hazel, though, is going to be talking about her previous doctoral research that she did at the University of Glasgow's MRC and CSO Social and Public Health Sciences Unit. Rory O'Connor is with us today, and he leads the Suicide Behaviour Research Lab at the University of Glasgow and is also, amongst other things, the President of the International Association of Suicide Prevention. Hi, Rory. Jenny Ferguson is the delivery lead of Action 8 of the Scottish Government Suicide Prevention Action Plan, and Action 8 aims to ensure that children and young people's needs are considered throughout the action plan. Also joining us today, as Jo said, are 2 of the Triumph Youth Advisory Group, Isla and Sam, along with Christine McClellan, who supports and oversees the YAG activities. So we're going to begin the webinar by asking each of our guests to deliver a short presentation, sharing what they see as being the biggest challenges in youth suicide prevention and what needs to be done. We'll then take a short break, and after we come back, Isla and Sam will share with us their thoughts and experiences in relation to youth suicide prevention. This will then be followed by a Q&A panel discussion. And if you've got any questions at all for our panel, then please put them in the Q&A and we will come to them. So before I hand over to our first speaker, though, I just want to say that we recognise that the subject of today's webinar can be very emotive, and it can be difficult for us all to think about and speak about suicide for very different reasons. We want this space to be as safe and supportive as it can be, and we encourage delegates and panel members to consider their own self-care both during and after today's session. So if anyone needs to take a break, turn their cameras off and leave, that's absolutely fine. And although we can't see who's in the room because you've all got your cameras off, you might want to take a wee minute to introduce yourselves in the chat. And now, without any further ado, as Jo said, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Professor Siobhan O'Neill. Siobhan.
Hello, Lynn. Thank you for that introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. And what a wonderful self-care introduction as well. Thanks for that. It's something we all need to be mindful of. Okay, so I'm going to be talking to you a wee bit about trauma and suicidal behaviour and transgenerational trauma, and why these things are linked, particularly in the context of Northern Ireland. So hopefully that should be, it's not sharing yet. Sharing has failed to start. Sorry, now let's try it again. Okay, I did that thing where I put it to full screen too quickly. All right, here we are. So thank you. Okay, so yeah, transgenerational trauma. Why is it relevant to suicide? Why is it relevant to youth suicide, particularly in Northern Ireland, and really looking at suicide prevention through a trauma-informed lens? So I always start these talks with a conceptualization of trauma and mental health, and how we're understanding trauma and mental health more and more now. So on the left there, we have this idea of trauma as being on a continuum, where we have psychological safety in one end, where we feel safe and social. It's the kind of rest and digest state that we want to be in, where we can learn, we can be curious, we can be compassionate. And then we have stress, which is necessary stress, but also then if stress mounts, it can become overwhelming. So this leads to distress. This is distress, or even trauma, where we have huge stressful things that happen to us that can overwhelm our ability to cope. But recognizing that all of these things are on a continuum, and for some people, necessary stress will be viewed as a challenge, and that's a positive thing and a good thing, and allows them to achieve their goals. And we all have different definitions of what will cause us distress, and even what might cause trauma for us. But all of these things affect our physiological health, our physical well-being. And we have the fight or flight response, sometimes called the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. It's how our body responds to stress and distress and trauma. And it's really there that we want to look whenever we're thinking about the effects of stress and distress and trauma on the body and the brain, and how that then links with suicidal behaviour. Okay, so one of the things we're interested in is what happens whenever people have a trauma exposure, something that overwhelms their ability to cope with. They feel that they can't cope. And it's useful to look at the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder when we're thinking about this. So post-traumatic stress disorder is characterized by flashbacks and nightmares. So it's a disease of memory. It's a condition that affects how a trauma is memorized and how that memory is processed and stored. And with post-traumatic stress disorder, the event can actually come back to the person in the form of flashbacks and nightmares. With PTSD, there's also avoidance and numbing behavior. So avoidance behavior to avoid the memory, the thing that happened, the trauma from ever happening again. And then we have the numbing of emotional affect, that flattening, that kind of flat response that people have after they've had a significant trauma. It's almost like a shock response. The third cluster of symptoms for PTSD is hypervigilance. So when someone has chronic stress or significant trauma, and particularly after they've had lots of flashbacks and nightmares, the third cluster of symptoms can kick in, and that's hypervigilance. And that's where their stress response has changed. Their threshold for the fight or flight response has changed. It's lowered in a way, and that person feels that they're constantly on edge or constantly anxious. So hypervigilance is associated with suicidal behavior because it is about that stress response and when it kicks in and what happens there. So those are the characteristics of trauma-related mental health problems. And what I'm really saying in terms of transgenerational transmission is that when you have a parent or two parents who have these clusters of symptoms, it increases the risk of adversities for the offspring, for the children who are raised by those parents of that parent. So Parental trauma can lead to childhood adversities, and that's the main way in which trauma is passed from one generation to the next. It's where the effects of the parents' trauma impacts on the environment in which the child is raised, and we know that's so important for good mental health and well-being. We've also seen through a whole range of studies, and ones in Northern Ireland show this as well, that trauma is associated with substance use, particularly alcohol use. We've seen that, and again, this impacts on that environment that the child's raised in, and impacts on their risk of mental illness too. It also impacts on attachment. It's said that flattening of affect can even impact on a parent's capacity to connect with their child, to feel those feelings of love. And that's a really kind of sad thing that can happen, where trauma impedes that attachment process. And of course, that attachment process is really important in shaping that child's stress response and helping shape the way that child can self-soothe and regulate their own emotions going forward. So again, all of these things, if they happen, increase the risk of mental illness. And of course, then we have the impact of hypervigilance and social violence that happens when people are constantly in high alert. And we've seen that in communities in Northern Ireland as well. So young people learn by copying the behaviour of the adults around them. And of course, if the adults are hypervigilant because of the fear and the trauma that they've experienced, then of course children will copy that. And again, that increases, it's said to increase the likelihood of them externalizing behaviours and responding then with violence against themselves or others as well, which increases the risk of suicide. So the main mechanism of transgenerational transmission of trauma is really adverse childhood experiences or ACEs, or childhood adversities, if you want to move away from this kind of ACE scale counting thing. So abuse, neglect, household dysfunction, parental mental illness, all much more common if the parents have been exposed to trauma. And we know the toxic stress in a child, where that child's stress response is activated repeatedly because of the environment that child's raised in, that can lead to hypervigilance in children, increased stress reactivity or numbing, disinterest, withdrawal. All of those things are associated then with mental health problems, and of course suicidal behaviour when the person's in a state of distress. So this is a little cycle that we developed a number of years ago when we were trying to explain transgenerational transmission of trauma in Northern Ireland to policymakers, and I think it's maybe quite useful here as well. So parental limitations compromise that attachment. That's so crucial. The child can then have difficulties with their own emotional regulation. There can be negative relationship and parenting styles. Even physical punishment in the home is much more common in Northern Ireland than other places. And of course, then that creates that cycle. It's very, very unhelpful in that sense. Adversities increase the risk of all sorts of mental health problems. The adolescent is exposed to alcohol and drugs and all of the challenges, and they struggle with self-regulation because of the childhood that they have, and they make poor relationships and life choices, and then they conceive children. And there's a lot of interest actually about biological transmission of trauma. What I would say is that most of the evidence is in animals, but there's some really interesting studies. There's the study of the little mice who were conditioned to have a fear of cherry blossoms. And of course, their baby mice also had that fear, and they had never smelt the cherry blossom. They'd never had electric shocks. They had never had that kind of exposure. So very, very interesting. It's probably about epigenetic processes. So it's not that there's a gene, it's that the genes are switched on and off, maybe in utero. And then the child is kind of conditioned to grow up in the world that the parent has grown up in. So if that's a world where they need to fight or run away a lot, then their stress response will be shaped to do that. But of course, that then can create problems for them. The good news, though, about all of these mechanisms of transmission is that we can halt them if we get in there early. And there's even studies showing that early intervention, particularly in the first 1,001 days, can actually impact on epigenetic processes that govern inflammation and stress response and all of those things that impacts then the risk of the child having mental illness later in life. So there's so much we can do if we can get in there early in this process. Thinking a wee bit more about Northern Ireland, we have high rates of suicidal behaviour here, and the trauma of the Troubles is certainly related to that. But one of the biggest adversities that our children here experience is deprivation and inequality. We have very high levels of poverty in Northern Ireland, and we know that that's an acute stressor that impacts on children and families' mental health and well-being. There's a lot of violence around. Certainly when I was growing up, there was a lot of violence on the TV, and it said that habituation to pain and violence can also increase the risk of suicidal behaviour too. People are living, some communities are still living in states of chronic stress and fear because of the risk of violence, which of course can lead to hypervigilance, which increases the risk then of impulsive behaviour and possibly suicidal behaviour there as well. We also have a phenomenon where we have a power sharing government, where we have two parties who are essentially in competition with one another, but they are joint first, they hold joint first minister posts. So there's a lot of mistrust of our leaders, and there's one side and another side. And that we often talk about two communities, the Catholic community and the Protestant community in Northern Ireland. So there would be higher levels of mistrust of our leaders here than perhaps in other places. And it's actually seeming to impact on our vaccination uptake rates at the minute as well. For some people, there's a sense of hopelessness and a sense of what has all the violence of the Troubles achieved, which can then lead to people feeling that they don't have a stake in society. We have high rates of substance use, of course, which is associated with suicidal behaviour as well in Northern Ireland. There are injustices. Certain communities feel that they haven't felt the dividends of the peace process. In some communities, there's that sense of reduced connectedness with broader society. Again, we can map these directly onto some of the models of suicidal behaviour, and we have still this us and them, this othering that happens, lots of hate crime, racism, homophobia in Northern Ireland, higher than other places as well. And we also sadly have the normalisation of suicidal behaviour in particular areas, and still very unsafe reporting of suicidal behaviour here. So these are all the issues that impact on suicidal behaviour in Northern Ireland, and how it relates to the trauma of our past. So what do we need? Well, we do need to be trauma informed about everything that we do, recognising particularly how we work out our politics in Northern Ireland and how we move forward, that we need to recognise the fear and the mistrust that certain individuals and communities feel, and be very aware of that and be trauma informed about that. And we do need to tackle ACEs and childhood adversity and inequalities and poverty and all of the social determinants of mental health that impact on the broader factors that influence young people's mental well-being. We've started to roll out a framework for education, for the education in schools, for mental health and well-being in schools, where we're going to do more on teaching metacognition, teaching resilient skills to young people, very important. And we have a 10-year mental health strategy now, where we are going to make a concerted effort to treat mental illness and even treat suicidal behaviour through our Towards Zero Suicide and other projects too, so that we can start to turn this around. And my role is very much about being part of this and talking to the public about what we're doing to change things. So hopefully that's helpful, and thank you.
Wow, thanks Siobhan. Honestly, you shared so much with us in such a short space of time, so you've given us lots to think about. Before we move on, is there anybody from the panel that maybe has a quick comment or question for Siobhan? Just one.
Yeah, if it's all right, I was just going to see if there was any kind of indication of a gender split when you look at the suicidal behaviour, especially within Northern Ireland, because we know kind of across the UK, it can be quite a big problem for young males. I just wondered if it was any different given the different experiences.
Thanks, Lauren.
Yeah, thanks. Good question. Our suicides are 75% male, around 75-25. We're doing some work on our suicide statistics where we have to reclassify some suicides from previous years as well. So we're still updating our figures. They're not right for the last 5 years. But yeah, we seem to have the same patterns. Although whenever we look at self-harm, suicide attempts, we can see more that 50-50 split, where or even sort of higher numbers of females, depending depending on which age group you look at as well, because you know, in those younger age groups there's certainly more women as well, so similar patterns to other places basically.
Thank you, and thanks. We'll have more time for questions later, but for now we're moving on to you, Lauren. It's time to hear from yourself as the team manager with Childline. So Lauren.
Thanks. So firstly, I'll give a bit of an overview of what Childline does as a service, just in case anyone's unaware of that. So Childline's a 24-hour confidential listening service for children and young people up to the age of 19. So that means that they can talk to us about absolutely anything that's on their mind, and quite often they'll come to us for things like emotional support, information about services, perhaps some advocacy if they were having trouble with services and what they've got going on at the moment. And the reason that Childline's become such a lifeline for so many young people is mainly due to our unique confidentiality promise. And it is unique in the sense of any other services that work with children don't have the same capacity to keep things confidential as we do. So we keep the vast majority of our counselling sessions confidential unless we believe that their life's in immediate danger, if they don't have the capacity to keep themselves safe, or if they're being abused by someone in a position of authority that might have other access to children and young people. There's a few more things that could go into those, but mainly those are the main 3 points that we would have to breach confidentiality on. So with so many young people turning to Childline to talk about what's going on for them, we're increasingly seeing that so many are thinking about having thoughts about suicide or have been impacted by suicide in some way. It remains in our top 5 main concerns for young people, so it's showing that it's pretty consistently prevalent in young people's lives. For example, since the first national lockdown, Childline has held more than 20,000 counselling sessions that feature young people discussing suicidal thoughts and feelings. It's something personally I hear about every day within my role and within the counselling room as well. So we know that this is something that's going on for young people more often, and it's becoming a lot more risky for us to deal with as an organisation. In our counselling sessions, it can range from fleeting thoughts of suicide, so maybe someone's just had a thought about it, or maybe it contributing to some kind of self-harming behaviour. It could be suicide planning, or they can contact us in the act of suicide. So not only do we work in suicide prevention, but we're increasingly working in suicide intervention, which requires quite a great deal of skill from our counsellors to cope with that. So counsellors will generally have open discussions and conversations about difficult feelings and become comfortable in holding those feelings. And that's quite a strange statement, I know, to say to be comfortable in holding suicidal feelings, but it's not immediately moving to intervention, not immediately moving to who can we talk to, who can we tell, but just being able to sit with them and say what's been going on, maybe explore some triggers, explore how their feelings usually go in these scenarios, and for us to feel comfortable in doing that. And that can be quite tricky despite the high level of risk, because it's not always just suicide that young people will talk to us about. This could be a product of everything else that's going on in their life. It could be quite prolonged, or it could be from a one-off traumatic event as well. The counsellor needs to ask quite specific, tailored questions to understand their young person's surroundings, their wider world, and also their own resilience and their capacity to be able to manage these feelings. All doing that whilst maintaining a rapport and whilst keeping a young person interested in what we're saying to them can be quite tricky, but our counsellors are fantastic at that skill, and they're able to do it time and time again. If they contact us in an emotional crisis, as we call it, so quite elevated emotions and feeling quite up here, maybe not able to engage with us as well as they normally would if they were feeling a bit calmer, we'll always work to de-escalate those feelings first, with an aim of having quite a meaningful conversation about what got them there and how we can avoid that level of crisis in the future. These things do come up and it's not always prolonged, but we'd like to be able to get people in a position where they can retain what we're saying and to feel quite comfortable in telling us what's been happening, with the explanation of our confidentiality, which usually helps greatly. If we do have to involve external services, it's not a decision that we take lightly. It will always aim to get consent before we do that. Sometimes it goes exceptionally well and we do get full consent and we get full details, name, address and location, everything that we need. Sometimes young people don't want to give us that. They've contacted us in a period of crisis. They maybe want to tell someone that this is what they're going to do to act on their suicidal feelings. We do have ways that we work with the emergency services where we can locate them. And that would normally come to me for that kind of decision, unless if they're an immediate life-threatening risk, a supervisor can take it on themselves to phone emergency services and get them located. If it's a little bit trickier than that and there's a few grey areas and we're not quite sure, that's the calls that will usually come through to me, and I will make those safeguarding decisions based on that and get the emergency services to them really quickly. We do have some challenges, as any organisation does, in being able to support young people with their suicidal feelings. I feel some of the main barriers are the actual barriers to young people seeking support themselves. Usually these will be feeling that they're not going to be believed and that their feelings are going to be minimised. And unfortunately, that is something that a number of them will experience. So statements like, it's just hormones, or it's just because you're going through puberty, we all feel sad sometimes. And my least favourite is don't be silly, which young people hear quite often. They can be exceptionally harmful, regardless of their intent. Adults might think that they're trying to minimise that to protect a young person, but actually what they're doing is completely dismissing very real and very powerful feelings at the time. Another challenge that we can face is if young people only engage with us in periods of crisis, that can actually result in a really unhelpful cycle of just repeated referrals. And essentially we're just a third party that's phoning the police and the ambulance service for them, which we are happy to do to ensure that they're safeguarded. But that also means that we don't get the opportunity to explore what's happened, what the trigger for it was, what's been going on long term, and able to get them that tailored support that they might need within the local community. So because we can provide advocacy and contact services on their behalf, it's really helpful for us the more that we know. So if a young person is in a cycle of contacting us in a state where they're not able to actually engage with us, it can become quite repetitive, which is something that we'd like to avoid when you're using the Childline service. And just due to the nature of how we work, we will have limited information. It's impossible for us to know absolutely everything about a young person's life, and we can only go from the information that they give us. So if they want to spend a 15-20 minute call telling us that they live in space, we will go off the basis of the fact that they live in space. We won't be arguing about that, and we'll focus on the feelings at the time. But we do like to engage with them in a more meaningful way to really understand what's going on, because from what we know, young people in their environment will quite often think that that is a normal environment. They won't recognise that it's adverse. They won't recognise that there's something that shouldn't be happening. And they will rely on professionals or adults around them to be able to say, it's not okay that that's going on, and it's not okay that you're experiencing that, and that's what you need help with. So the more that we know, the more that we can provide that. And our work relies really heavily on a trust between the service and the person using the service. And rapport is much easier. It's built much easier in a lower risk contact. Something that's a bit calmer, something that you can take your time with, maybe have a bit of humour with with the person that you're speaking to. We can build rapport in a higher risk contact, but it can be a little bit trickier, and we might need to get to that stage of trust a little bit quicker so that we can get those results that we want to see, which is the young person being kept safe. The main priorities for us, and I think the main one for me, would be teaching active listening as a skill to adults, to professionals, to anyone that's working with children. We all think that we can listen, but active listening is actually quite different to what we're used to, and it's something that our counsellors have to learn over quite an extended period of time. Active listening requires you to not have judgment, and also to not relate this to your own experience. Something that we do conversationally with each other is, oh yeah, I've experienced that before, or when I felt like that, I sought therapy. But if we compared our experiences on paper, mine might be word for word exactly the same as yours, but it will be vastly different in a lived experience. So relating to that can also be very unhelpful, and it can make someone feel that they're not coping right, which actually doesn't really exist. We cope how we cope. So if we learn that active listening skill and use the empathy instead of sympathy, we can then have these open conversations that would normally be seen as quite difficult and quite taboo. Actually, we can get comfortable with it. And in that kind of same token, informing children from a young age what to do when the feelings arise for them and how to cope with them. So if we can equip children from a young age about what feelings actually feel like, what they physically feel like, and not just the names for them, and techniques for how to manage those feelings, we can recognise who to go to when those feelings become unmanageable. This isn't to say that if we teach children about feelings from a young age that they'll always be completely self-regulated and they'll always be able to get through a crisis. Things are going to happen, and they need to know who to go to seek support when that does happen, or know how to take themselves away and think about what they need at that time. Hopefully, if we were to do that in quite a widespread way, we wouldn't see as many young people reaching crisis point, because it's not been allowed to bubble over to that extent. It would also be, if we were living in a perfect world, it would be amazing to see more community support and more diverse psychological therapies as well. We know that services like CAMHS are completely stretched. Their limits and their waiting lists are exceptionally long. That's not to fault them. They are completely overwhelmed and what they do is fantastic. But maybe with more community health support being more accessible, as well as more diverse therapies other than, say, just CBT, for example, we could limit people having to use these services long term. Because the way that Childline works is we would always tailor our response to each young person that comes through to us. And it would be great to see that in the wider sense, we tailor to each person rather than give the kind of same therapies that don't often work for the specific person. And lastly, just a recognition for people that are working with children, the recognition of the impact of early trauma and how this can affect resilience in the long term. So having that kind of informed practice of, for example, we'll quite often see that people getting into trouble at school, they'll be getting sent out of classes, they'll be getting seen as the kind of bad child or the disruptive child. And we should really be looking at that as what's causing this, rather than treating them as the problem, seeing them as a whole individual and understanding how that can affect us. Thank you.
No, thank you, Lauren. That was really helpful and interesting to hear about things from the perspective of you on the helpline and the work that you do at Childline. Again, we're going to save our questions till the end, but I do wonder if anyone on the panel wanted to, maybe make a reflection on Lauren's presentation or ask her a question. No questions for you, Lauren.
I'll ask a quick one, actually, Lauren.
Okay. Great
presentation. But so, in terms of the resources with the increase in demand, because of the pandemic, obviously witnessed this funny trajectory of calls and to helplines. So, how's the funding work for you in terms of meeting that demand?
So we had quite a substantial drop in volunteers when COVID hit with self-isolation, etc. So it meant that our staff had to kind of go in a little bit more. And we also had to create a virtual team which could answer emails from home in order to kind of access that. I'm not too sure in terms of funding how that went. I know that we were still able to access certain grants, but I do know that it was we took a huge hit with COVID, and pre-COVID maybe taking about 700 plus counselling sessions a day, and we're now creeping back up to about 550 to 600 a day. So we're slowly getting back to where we were, but we are just consistently not meeting the demand, which is really worrying given the presentations that we're hearing on the helpline just now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Hazel, and thank you, Rory, for that question. Oh, sorry, didn't mean Hazel. I'm thinking of Hazel because we are now about to go to Hazel. So I'm getting ahead of myself. Thank you, Lauren. And Hazel, if you're ready, we're going to hand over to you now.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Hazel Marzetti and I'm a postdoctoral research associate on the Suicide in As Politics project at the University of Edinburgh. But today I'm going to be reporting on the findings of my doctoral research, which was supervised by Professors Lisa McDade, Rory O'Connor and Rich Mitchell, which I finished up last year at the University of Glasgow, looking at LGBT+ youth suicide in Scotland. Today I'm going to use some quotes throughout this presentation, but I am going to ask that you please don't photograph and share any of the quotes, as whilst I have permission to share them, I fear that it could be quite confronting for a participant to see them when they're doing a bit of casual scrolling, so I hope that's okay with you guys. It's also worth saying that this is going to be a total whistle-stop tour of my findings, but if you'd like more details or to discuss them, please get in touch. My contact details will be on the last slide in this presentation. I would really, really love to hear from you. Okay, so globally, suicide is a leading cause of death amongst young people aged 15 to 29. And within this young population, LGBT+ young people are estimated to be somewhere between 3 and 4 times more likely to think about and attempt suicide. However, here in the UK, our evidence about this disparity is patchy, potentially because we don't like asking young people about their sexual orientation, their trans identity, or their suicidal thoughts and attempts. And so bringing this together means it's a topic that isn't really talked about. And this is particularly the case here in Scotland, as a majority of research that does exist has focused on young people living in England and Wales. And for this reason, I decided in my PhD study to solely focus on those young people living in Scotland. Just wanted to say a few words about the acronym, the LGBT+ acronym, and we use this to include anyone that didn't define their sexual orientation and gender identity as simultaneously cisgender, heterosexual and heteroromantic. And it was chosen because it's recognisable and identifiable and allowed the participants in this study to find us. But I think it's also worth noting that many participants in the study identified their sexual orientation or gender identity outside of those strict kind of lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans categories, and instead would be best represented by the plus sign, and that's something that we as researchers need to take account of. So, whilst it's well established that LGBT+ young people are more likely than their cisgender heterosexual peers to think about and attempt suicide, less is known about why this is the case or about how young people themselves make sense of this. So in this project, I used a qualitative methodology to conduct in-depth interviews with 24 LGBT+ young people with lived experience of suicidal distress living here in Scotland. And together we talked about what they perceive were the important factors contributing to and protecting them from suicide, as well as how they made sense of this and how they believed we could reduce LGBT+ youth suicide in the future. So here we have an overview of contributory factors that participants in this study considered important. LGBT+ youth suicide research has been criticised for over-focusing on those factors considered LGBT+ specific. And so here we see on the slide, there are a range of factors that were either LGBT+ specific or were heavily influenced by homophobia, biphobia, or transphobia. Taken together, I'm going to use the term queerphobia. And these are things like coming out, bullying and social isolation, and community climate. But there are also some factors that we perhaps expect to see more broadly amongst all young people experiencing suicidal distress, so things like abuse and educational challenges, which are often forgotten about when we talk about LGBT+ young people, because there's a tendency to focus in on those factors that are deemed LGBT+ specific. This said, I think it's really important to understand how these factors can interact with one another. So for example, bullying was often happening at school, but for young people whose parents had struggled to accept their LGBT+ identity, school could be a place in which there was a great need to achieve in order to do well and move away to university, which for the majority of participants in this study was the only gateway they envisaged for living independently away from home. And therefore schools were for many a high pressured environment. The community climate in which participants lived was widely discussed as a subtle yet important contributor. For many, there were a range of everyday comments and questions that established being cisgender, heterosexual, heteroromantic as both normal and desirable, therefore creating LGBT+ lives as inevitably contravening this norm. So in this quote, we hear starkly from Yasmin that it was against this backdrop, expectation of non-acceptance, that everything else was experienced. The consequences of these feelings of queerphobia are then exemplified in this quote by Ewan, who describes this sense for him of what he termed do or die. So he stated that he felt he would eventually either find a way to come out or die by suicide. But for Ewan, coming out really represented an enormous barrier to him, as he was incredibly concerned about the homophobic stigma that he would face and therefore the associated loss of standing within his community. But he also in this quote articulates something really important about his own understanding of suicidal distress, which he articulates as not real or not serious. And this was kind of echoed across a number of participants. We're going to just briefly talk about it. So all participants in this study had begun to think about suicide age 14 or younger. But for many, these early suicidal thoughts are classified using the kinds of terms that we're seeing on the slide. They diminished their significance. And this was due, they said, to an early lack of intention to act upon them. However, despite this, the majority of participants went on to have further suicidal thoughts, which they had experienced an intention to act on or had acted upon. So despite participants kind of diminishing the importance of these early suicidal thoughts, they perhaps offer an opportunity for early intervention that as researchers we should really be taking note of. So many studies have kind of described young people as reluctant to seek out support, and maybe perhaps echoing some of the things that were said by the previous presenter. In this study, the majority of participants had been very proactive about help seeking, although they talked about facing barriers to accessing the support they wanted to access. And it is these barriers that I'm going to just briefly touch upon. So one challenge within this specific population was the balance of specialist mental health care and gender affirming healthcare. So some participants reported that neither service felt sufficiently specialised to provide care for trans young people experiencing suicidal distress. And as a result, some young people felt that they had ended up kind of battered between the services or trapped between the services without the support that they desired. Other participants spoke about being a burden on their family and friends, and they were really concerned about this, which is something that's echoed across lots of people who experience suicidal distress. In this population, though, this was reinforced where participants talked about their parents having negative attitudes towards help seeking, either diminishing the severity of the young people's distress or expressing a reluctance about help, either through medication or talking services. Finally, some participants described being told that their distress was part and parcel of being a teenager and would pass. But what seemed less clear to them was about what to do if it didn't pass. And this was particularly the case for participants who hadn't wanted to share the severity of their distress with their suicidal thoughts or their self-harm in an initial disclosure, perhaps to their GP. So what helped? Professional support with a therapeutic alliance between the participant and the practitioner had the potential to have a hugely positive impact. But unfortunately, due to the time limitations on things like counselling and therapeutic services, some participants reported limited impact, with sessions helping whilst they were happening, but not necessarily having a sustained impact after the contact with the professional had ended. Further to this, in times of crisis, immediately accessible support was prioritised by participants, and this was often provided through third sector organisations, through helplines and chat lines, or by their friends who were often other LGBT+ young people. So there was this kind of recognition that whilst they really wanted to be supported by their peers and that was really effective, there were challenges because their peers and themselves, when they were providing support, maybe didn't feel like they had the skills and didn't feel like they had support for providing that peer support, which is really important to acknowledge. Participants also found that connection to other LGBT+ young people, either online, often through social media, or offline through things like university societies, youth groups, or chance meetings with other LGBT+ young people, was incredibly beneficial for reducing isolation and giving a sense of collective identity and belonging. To end the interview, we asked participants what they believe would help reduce LGBT+ youth suicide in the future. And participants felt that firstly, challenging queerphobic stigma in wider society would help to tackle the contributors to suicidal distress at its roots. So this could be through popular cultural positive representations of LGBT+ people, like through things like films or books or TV, but also, and it was really, really emphasised, through the curriculum. Of course, recently here in Scotland, the LGBTI inclusive curriculum has been introduced, and so there's a real opportunity to better understand the impact that can have on tackling stigma and also on reducing young people's suicidal distress. Participants also suggested that professional mental health care that was sensitive to LGBT+ issues and people was extremely important, and felt that there needed to be more resourcing put into general mental health care. In addition to this, some participants suggested that as many were supported by their friends and were supporting their friends, greater support in terms of upskilling young people, providing peer support, but also providing care for them, was thought it would be really helpful to reduce LGBT+ youth suicide in the future. So thank you very much. I know that was like such a whistle-stop tour, but please do get in touch if you're interested and you want to chat more. Thank you ever so much.
No, thank you, Hazel. And I found, I found the whole presentation really interesting, but I found the quotes from the young people really powerful, and they really did bring it to life. Does anyone on the panel have any questions or comments for Hazel?
I wanted to say that I found the presentation really, really interesting, and it resonated like a lot with me and like my experience as well. And I think like what you were saying about like early suicidal thoughts and the way that they're not always like recognized because they don't really fit with what like mental health professionals are expecting to be like suicidal behaviors. I think that's really important. And like myself and like a lot of people that I know have had that experience of having like kind of atypical suicidal thoughts that just don't get any support at all.
Thanks, Isla.
Thank you, Isla. Thank you. I'm really glad that resonated.
Yeah, it's really affirming. Thank you. And thanks, Hazel. We're doing so well. You're sharing so much information in such short spaces of time. So I hope everyone's managing to keep up. And as I said before, if anyone needs to take a little break or turn the camera off, then please do. Because we're now going to move on to Rory O'Connor. It's time for Rory's presentation. Over to you, Rory. Thank you.
Cannot believe I did that. Started without unmuting myself. Can you hear me okay? Because my internet's been a bit funny. But yes, if we can hear me clearly. Actually, just want to start with
loud and clear, Rory. Loud and clear.
From Isla's comment on Hazel's excellent presentation, I think it's a really important message that there's no such thing as typical suicidal ideation or the evolution of suicidal thoughts are unique for everybody. Obviously, there are common features, and I'll try and touch on some of the common features, but the causes are many and evolve across the lifespan. So what I want to do over the next 10 minutes is talk about sort of a couple of things, to looking at some of the sort of epidemiological evidence of youth self-harm and suicidal behavior, and then maybe COVID, and then some of the work we've been doing in terms of my model of suicide and how I go about conceptualizing why risk, because your understanding of why people become vulnerable will obviously inform interventions. Now, first thing to note is that from the research evidence across the world, any form of self-injurious behavior, self-harm or suicidal behavior, irrespective of its motives, is very rare before puberty. Obviously, that's not to say it doesn't happen, but statistically it's very rare. And where we start to see the big increases in the onset, A, of mental health problems, and B, of any form of self-harming behavior or suicidal behavior, is in adolescence. And indeed, adolescence is a period in our life in which you see the steepest increase. So no other time across the lifespan do you see such an increase of onset of mental health challenges. Now, here's some data. We, a few years ago, conducted what's known as the Scottish Wellbeing Study, in which we recruited 3,500 young people aged 18 to 34, or young adults 18 to 34, and everybody's interviewed in their homes, but we asked a whole range of questions, and in challenging questions like these, they were completed on computer, and Ipsos Mori, the social research company, did this work for us. But what it gives is, for the first time, is some indication of the prevalence of self-harm and suicide attempts. Now, I could spend the whole of my time discussing what we mean by the different terms, self-harm or suicide attempts, but for purposes of today, self-harm includes any form of self-injurious behavior, irrespective of its motive, and suicide attempts, obviously, at least part of their motivation for their behavior was to end their life. But what's stark here is just the prevalence, how common it is in this age group. So if we just look on, I've just focused in on the left-hand figure on the lifetime rates, and you can see 11% of young people reported they'd attempted suicide at some stage in their life, and 16% reported some form of self-harm. And indeed, there was lots of overlap. Lots of people reported both. The most, when we looked at the onset of when self-harm or suicide attempts occur, the onset is earlier in girls versus boys. And this doesn't take into consideration any other gender identities. This is just people who identify as males and those who identify as females. So there's a whole, as Hazel talked about in some of her work, we have a whole mountain of work to do there. But the point is that most of the, even though the onset tends to be earlier in girls and boys, most of the self-harm or suicidal behavior first occurs in those, 14 and 15 years is the sort of age of onset. And then more recently, so that's just giving you before COVID times. What I want to just focus in now is just to give some sense of the of some of the data we've been collecting currently in COVID. Also, just before I talk about the data we collected in COVID, or since COVID has began, it's just a note that Hazel, I think, presented some of the statistics on suicides and depending which country in the world you're in, with suicide in young adults, young people even aged 15 to 24 is either in some cases, the second leading cause of death, and others, depending how you do the analysis, leading cause of death. But the point is, the first or second or third leading cause of death amongst young people. So that in and of itself is really, really striking and illustrates why we need to really focus on this as a topic. Now, the other thing to say on suicide statistics is, even though across the UK we've witnessed, since the most recent data we have suggests there's been a bit of a decrease in suicides since COVID, but that only covers a small period of COVID. But the thing to highlight, though, is even against this backdrop of decrease in suicide rates, that's against the backdrop of the previous 2 or 3 years suicide rates being on the increase. But where we have seen an increase pre-COVID, and there's still signals of this post-COVID, is an increase in suicides amongst young women and young girls. So we really need to disentangle and understand that better. Okay, so then post-COVID, we've been doing what's known as the UK mental health and well-being, COVID mental health and well-being study. I'm just going to give you some indication of the mental distress out there based on some of our data, initially just covering waves 1 to 3 of the pandemic. So I'm just going to show you a couple of slides, an overall slide looking at suicidal thoughts for the whole population, and then specifically within young people. But gives you a sense that this is just from like the end of March 2020 through to the start of May. Now, what I'm going to say now holds, we could, so the end of March or the middle of March 2021, and it's the same story. So it's a consistent pattern. So the first thing to note is the early part of the pandemic, we saw this increase across the first 6 weeks of lockdown in the UK. Now, we can't say anything about pre-lockdown because we don't have pre-lockdown data, but it was stark that we saw this increase in suicidal thoughts. That was even more stark because at the same time, levels of depressive symptoms seemed to be about the same, and levels of anxiety were on the decrease. And then what's even more concerning for the purposes of today and looking at early indicators of risk or vulnerability in young people is, again, just only focus in on this left-hand graph, which is suicidal ideation across age groups. And then what's as clear as day is the young people are reporting, in this case aged 18 to 29, reporting the highest rates of suicidal ideation. Now, I haven't got the slide for this, you just have to take my word for it, is that we've looked at the most recent data. The young people are now reporting their highest rates of suicidal ideation in the last lockdown, higher than what they were experiencing in wave 3. So what it illustrates is, even though we've all done some form of acclimatizing or habituating to this new world that we're living in, but the concern, if you look at the impact on social relationships, the impact on employment, on education prospects, and so on, post-pandemic, I mean, I think that we need to really focus on our young people as well as other groups who are vulnerable, such as people with pre-existing mental health problems, people from more socially disadvantaged backgrounds, and looking at other indicators of risk, looking at women as well and young and girls. Now, what we need to try then to understand, and each of the previous presentations in their different ways have tapped into understanding the complexity around suicide risk. And this is just a figure we published a few years ago, or 2 years ago, but what it highlights is if you're to understand suicide risk, you have to understand, first of all, you have to take a lifespan perspective, and we've already touched on early life adversity and trauma, strongly associated with suicide risk. Siobhan's work has touched on that, Hazel's touched on that. I think all the presentations actually this morning have or today, this afternoon, have mentioned that. But what I'm just going to focus in on, although there's a whole range of factors associated with suicide, and they come from sort of clinical, social, biological, and cultural and backgrounds, what I'm going to focus in on is the work that we've been really done over the last number of years is this bottom bit of the model, looking at these proximal risk factors. And I've been arguing for a long time, along with others, that if we're to understand suicide risk, we need to look beyond mental health problems. This collection of factors that we all experience in our lives impacts on each of us differentially. And that impacts sadly for 6,000 or 7,000 people across the UK each year, such that they feel so trapped by the pain that they're experiencing that they see suicide as a way of ending their pain. And so in terms of that broad concept, sort of overview, the work that my group have been sort of really involved in and others is really trying to understand the evolution of that sense of entrapment. And again, this is just a model of suicide. I've developed the integrated motivational volitional model. It's a whole range, it's beyond the scope of today to go into it in detail. There's lots of free resources on our website, suicideresearch.info, if you want to know more about it. But in essence, I want to just point to a couple of key points, is that in a very parsimonious way, people become suicidal because either they experience feelings of defeat or humiliation from which they cannot escape. And it's that sense of being trapped by defeat and humiliation, which is a key driver to the emergence of suicidal thoughts. Now, of course, feelings of defeat and humiliation can be also driven by loss, rejection, shame, and they are coming together in this sort of perfect storm to increase this mental pain that somebody is trying to escape from. And so for me, the key challenge is if you're trying to understand suicide risk in young people, never mind what age, but in this case, in young people, we need to understand what are the drivers to that sense of being trapped by mental pain. And then the other key factor that the model argues is that the factors that lead somebody to act on their thoughts of suicide are different from the factors that lead somebody to become suicidal. So just take a pause for a second there. So thus far, my point, it's framed as a question here, what we're all trying to understand is what are the stressors in this wider sense that increase feelings of defeat, humiliation, loss, shame, and so on in young people? And how have they changed in recent years to maybe account for the increased rates of mental health problems, which is evident pre-pandemic, continues to be evident. And we've touched on CAMS and calls to Childline and other organizations. I mean, there's huge demand and huge indicators of distress. And then just the last few things I want to just say are on that second bit of my model of, there's one thing looking at the factors that lead somebody to become suicidal. The second one is understanding those factors that lead somebody to what we describe as crossing the precipice. And I'll talk about all of this work in a book I published this year, which is sort of helping us trying to understand suicide. But this is a quote from the start of the book, which is a heartbreaking or start of the chapter on understanding this transition from thoughts of suicide to suicidal acts. And it's from a mother whose son took his life. And it's just a heartbreaking quote, which really highlights the challenge of many of us who've been bereaved by suicide, trying to understand why we didn't, or were unable to prevent a suicide, or how we didn't spot the signs that somebody would act on their thoughts. And it really is heartbreaking. And I suppose the key message, if you are bereaved, is no one person can ever be held responsible for their actions of somebody else. And although it's difficult when you're sitting there bereaved to not wish what could you've done differently, please try not to, because it isn't your fault, and it's just such a complex thing to predict. And indeed, our ability to predict suicide is no better than chance, is no better than the flipping of a coin. But just the last couple of things I want to say, though, are so what I try to do with my model of suicide then is understand that transition. Who's more likely to act on their thoughts? And this last figure, and again, all these details are all available on our website and elsewhere, is that this slide here is simply the right-hand bit of my model, which I call the volitional phase. The third bit of my model, and the argument here is the presence of these sorts of factors, which range from having access to means of suicide, to being impulsive, to having a family or friend who's died by suicide or attempted suicide. They're all factors associated with the increased likelihood of suicide. So the message here then is, if somebody is expressing suicidal thoughts, it's really important that we get some sense of the presence of these, what I describe as volitional factors, to then hopefully be able to mitigate risk. So although we can't predict who will die by suicide very well, we can do as much as we can at all levels, at an individual level, at a community level, at a schools level, or whatever it may be, or, and crucially also at a policy level, to reduce that risk in everyone. So just the last thing I just want to end with is two last slides. So really what I've tried to illustrate is what sort of the complexity of the factors, but honing in on this idea of understanding the causes of entrapment. So we need to really understand better the complex set of factors, and those factors, the sort of distal factors, will be different for different people and different vulnerable groups. But the question I would always ask is, how do they impact on individuals such that they'll feel defeated or humiliated, and then they feel trapped by that situation? And then in priority areas, I think one of the key priorities has to be supporting young people as they recover from the pandemic, because we've all been through this bizarre experiment of social restrictions and put in place. And it's been a best guess, but it only is a guess of what to protect people's physical health primarily, and then obviously mental health. So we need to do more about understanding and tailoring that. But I suppose my last message, though, is what we all should be trying to do and what think about is, what are those factors, as I said already? Because anything we can do, any one of us on an individual level, as well as on a system level, we can all think about, we can all do something which reduces the causes of defeat, or making somebody feel defeated or humiliated or lost or shame. And anything that does that ultimately then will also hopefully contribute to a reduction in entrapment and improvement in well-being for all of us, but in particular our young people who are most vulnerable. Okay, that's me. Thank you.
Thank you, Rory. There was so much in that, and thank you for squeezing it all into such a short space of time. And I feel that for everybody's presentations, we're not going to have time for a question from our panel member, but we do have a Q&A after the young people's presentations later. So we'll come back to you then, Rory, and see if anyone has questions for you, if that's okay. We're now going to take a change of pace again, and you did finish talking about what we can do with policy, and we're now going to move on to Jenny Ferguson, who's going to talk to us about this from a policy perspective in Scotland, I should say, because I know that this is obviously a UK-wide audience and group, but this is what's going on in Scotland. Thanks.
Thanks, Lynn, for that introduction. I have to firstly apologise before I even begin my presentation. My internet is playing up. I keep getting a wee pesky alert saying that it's keeps playing up. So I'm going to share my screen and share my presentation and switch my camera off, but I'm going to keep speaking throughout. So hopefully you can be able to visualise what I look like. So I'll share the screen now. Okay. Hopefully that's come across to you all now. Okay, so as you can see, I've taken a slightly different approach. I'm here today to talk to you about how we're considering children and young people's needs in the delivery of the Scottish Government Suicide Prevention Action Plan. My background is participation with young people. So whenever I do work, I always want to do it in a way that's interactive, a way that's youth friendly, and a way that gives people an experience. So today I am going to take you through the TV show, the Ninja Warrior Assault course, and talk about different topics. So let's go into the course and start at the start. So the first thing that is to be answered is, how does my work relate to the field of youth suicide prevention? So when my camera was playing up, I realised you might not get to see what I look like. So I pulled across a little picture that one of my brownies drew of me. So that is me with glasses on, which I think is a good description of big hair and glasses. So what does the background of this work look like? So the NSPLG, which Rory, who you just heard from, sits on, they have a role in this. They were established to help drive the implementation of the Scottish Government Suicide Prevention Action Plan. The action plan is 10 actions. I think that if I was to talk about the 10 actions and what they're looking like for children and young people, that would be the full 10 minutes that you would get from me. But I think that it's fair to say they range across lots of different things. And Action 8, which I am the delivery lead for, is tasked with ensuring that all of the actions consider children and young people's needs. We are also linked into the Children and Young People's Mental Health and Wellbeing Joint Delivery Board that is co-chaired by COSLA and the Scottish Government. And it's worth actually flagging that on the Scottish Government's website, under Children and Young People's Mental Health Wellbeing Joint Delivery Board, they have recently produced a newsletter that will come out quarterly that gives you updates on that work. So if you want to know what's happening there, then sign up to the newsletter. Another thing that I want to flag that's new and just been released under the Suicide Prevention Action Plan is that there has been new resources produced for the children and young people's workforce that looks at, there's 3 educational animations that have been created to support the learning about mental health, self-harm and suicide prevention, specifically for the wider children and young people's workforce. So that is up on the TURAS website, and also I've put a link here on my slides. And if anybody is interested, then I can make sure that you're sent across an update on what's happening there and how to access these resources. The next question that I want to answer is, what are the challenges in this work? And I think that actually colleagues that I spoke today have articulated that really, really well. I think for me, what I have tried to do is reflect on the Ninja Warrior Assault course as a way of understanding experiences I've worked with lots of young people, particularly young people that have got care experience or people that have got youth justice experience. And a lot of the things that they've articulated for me, actually, I think reflecting on this assault course actually gives quite an image to that. A lot of young people have talked about being trapped and felt like they were going through challenges that once they got past one challenge, they were going on to another challenge, often with less energy and often feeling really, really overwhelmed in it. A lot of young people have spoke about feeling like they're on the outside looking in, that there's some kind of spectatorship. And I think the idea of there being sort of a presenter and there being an audience of the assault course kind of projects that for some young people. And a lot of young people have talked about no matter what they did, things didn't get easier. They weren't able to change the situation that they were in to make life more easy for them to survive. The other thing that I think the assault course offers is that it's unique for everybody. It's unique how they arrive and begin the course that they experience, but also how they experience the different issues that they go through will look very different for every individual person. It might be individual experiences they have, community experiences that they've gone through, or actually national experiences that they've gone through that will affect that. The other thing, reflecting on what everybody else has said today, is the obstacles that lead a young person to entering the course will look really different, the trauma that they've experienced. So it may be that they have had an environment that, for example, there's poverty plays a role. It may be their family environment, their community environment, and that plays a role to them entering the course, but also plays a role to how they experience the course. It could be a life event that's actually part of the course and adds to the course, or it could be a life event that puts them in the course. And as well, their resilience. I think young people as well by themselves will have different thresholds of different things experiencing for them, but putting that in the context of all the other things that are going on, it plays a role, but it's definitely not the biggest role. The other thing that young people speak about is the importance of relationships. Again and again, we heard from the Independent Care Review in Scotland and the young people in that about love, which I think was amazing and beautiful, and about the role of relationships. And actually, if I think about relationships in the context of this course, we're talking about maybe actually somebody's family member sitting in the crowd cheering them on, helping them get through a situation. We're maybe talking about a family member training a young person, giving them the skills to be able to cope with something that is a challenge at a low level, not an overwhelming challenge. I also have adults in young people's lives running the course with them. And actually, when they get to a point that they have to reach a high barrier, they pull the barrier down for them so that they can jump on it, so that they can get to the next step. And we also know that there's adults in young people's lives and structures in young people's lives that actually can dismantle this course or actually restrict a young person from entering challenges that are too difficult for them, or actually editing it depending on their needs. It may be that actually we need to lower the barrier that somebody needs to reach to, that we make the steps that somebody has to jump from different stepping stones shorter. So what is Action 8 of the Suicide Prevention Action Plan? So Action 8, and what is written on the tin, is that NSPLG will ensure that all of the actions of the Suicide Prevention Action Plan considers the needs of children and young people. And I think that the approach that's been taken there is co-production at its heart, and co-production is where professionals and citizens making better use of each other's assets and resources and contributions to achieve better outcomes and or improving efficiency. I think it recognises that young people have run that course in different ways, and they've got insights, skills and experiences that will help us reflect, well, what could we change? What do we need to change structurally to make sure that the course doesn't exist where it needs to not exist, or actually where there's things that young people are going to face that are challenging, how do we make it better for them? What can we take down and what can we put stepping stools up for? We also recognise that young people may have experienced the course where a family member's been through it. They could have run through it with an adult in their life, or they could have been in the audience watching that. And we need to recognise that and listen to those young people too. And it also recognises that young people are experts in being young. So actually we might come up with something that sounds really good, but actually is it going to work for young people in the way that they interact with different things? And down the bottom, I've just put a list of resources that I've found really useful when I'm thinking about participation, of what good practice looks like and how do we implement it. The next thing I want to talk about is what are the priorities for Action 8 in ensuring that we take that co-productive approach. So we are setting up a youth advisory group for young people that are aged 16 to 25, young people that have had experiences. So they may have run through that assault course, or they may have actually sat in the audience and watched someone else run through that assault course. We're looking to pull together a group of 12 young people, and that these young people will have been referred to us through referral pathways to ensure that actually somebody has referred them and at the right stage in their life to be able to join such a group, and it to be an opportunity to change things rather than feel overwhelming. The group, we have said, will have an advisory role, and I think that's really important because that advisory role gives them power within this work. It will be their role to be able to identify opportunities, issues and constraints in how the Suicide Prevention Action Plan considers children and young people. It won't be that we take, that I, as the delivery lead, take ideas to the young people and say, what do you think? It will be about working with them so that they can create the ideas and we can look and see how we can get these implemented. But again, going back to that co-productive idea, it will be as well for the young people to work with people that have got expertise, so as we're making the best use of everybody's voices.
Jenny, do you have one last point to make? Because that's just about time. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's no problem at all.
Thanks.
So that's okay. No, you're fine. The other thing that we are setting up to complement the participation network is we will have a youth advisory group. So we will have a participation network, and that will really be able to bring in networks of organisations that have young people that want to have their voice heard in this work. And I will put this onto the last slide, and that way everybody can have their break. So that was me. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Jenny. And I'm really sorry to cut it short. It sounds like there's so much going on within the policy, and it's really good to hear, I think, mostly just about the co-production element of it, and that you are involving children and young people in that process as much as you are. But I do think with, the amount of really powerful and informative presentations that we've had, it's really important that we do take a short break now. And if I could just ask everybody, to come back here for 20 past, get yourselves a drink, go to the bathroom. It is a short break. And when we come back, I know Hazel's laughing because I'm telling you all what to do during your break as well. I'm like, you must get a drink and you must go to the bathroom. But yeah, if you can all come back for 20 past, please. And then we're going to hear from Isla and Sam before we move into our panel discussion. So thanks to all the presenters so far, and I look forward to seeing you all again very soon. Okay, thanks. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the second half. We've got exactly 60 seconds before we're going to start the next presentations. And I'm so sorry I had to cut your presentation short, Jenny. It was amazing. But I hope you understand, just in the interest of time, we need to get through the other presentations and the panel discussion. But if anybody has any questions for Jenny, please put them in the Q&A because we will come to them. Thank you. Okay, as I said already, our presenters this afternoon after the break are going to be Isla and Sam. And Isla is one of our YAG, and she's going to start and give us her experiences and perspectives on youth suicide prevention. So over to you, Isla.
Hi, so this is going to be quite quick because I've got a lot of things to fit into 7 minutes, and it's just going to touch on what I think some of the points of issue are and some of my experiences from being at crisis stage after a lot of different stages of suicidality were missed. So one of the main issues that I think prevent young people from getting effective support and preventing suicide is communication. There are generational differences in the way that people communicate. Our generation has destigmatized a lot of mental health topics, and a lot of us use humor as a coping mechanism. So we're able to talk about some really difficult topics quite comfortably and quite openly, which has prevented people from getting support in the past, because a lot of practitioners focus on the way that people speak as well as what they're talking about. So I've been denied, referrals and support from my GP because the way that I spoke about my issues was too comfortable and too matter of fact, even though I was bringing up some very distressing topics. So young people really need to have access to professionals who are trained and experienced in dealing with young people specifically. There obviously are those people out there, you know, like there's people at CAMS who focus on young people, and there's like other agencies and things, but you know, they're not always there when we need them. I've been, you know, in the hospital multiple times after suicide attempts where there's been someone on call for CAMS and they've not turned up, and I've been assessed by, you know, adult psychiatric services that are not equipped to speak to young people, and I've been asked questions that just weren't relevant to my life and didn't get to the points that needed raised and the issues that needed spoken about. One of the other issues that I think is really important is the autonomy and respect that young people get treated with when they access support and services. Young people are not respected in general the same way as adults, unfortunately, when they're asking for help. One of the massive issues that I've come across is breaches of confidentiality with young people. Obviously, if somebody is at a significant risk to themselves or others, there are reasons that confidentiality has to be broken. But in my experience, confidentiality has been broken for the opposite reason, to tell people that somebody didn't think I was a risk to myself. And there's just not really an excuse for that just because I'm a young person. Young people aren't believed. People have said this in their presentations. Unfortunately, there seems to be a bias against young people, that we don't understand ourselves and who we are as people, and that because we don't have adult responsibilities, we can't have mental health problems, and that's just not the case. We understand how we feel, even if we're not sure ultimately who we are as a person and who we'll become, because obviously it is a formative time in our life. And not being believed and not getting that respect just alienates young people and encourages them to deal with things on their own. And when someone's dealing with self-harm and suicidal ideation, dealing with that by yourself just becomes dangerous. So that kind of leads on to safeguarding, which is obviously really important, dealing with young people and dealing with vulnerable young people. But ineffective safeguarding can be completely counterproductive and can push people further towards dangerous outcomes. And that's happened to me, unfortunately, where, you know, I've put my trust in adults, as young people do, because they are the people that we think have it together, that know what's going on, have been where we are and know what to do. And we get mixed messages a lot of the time. You know, I've had people that I've tried to reach out to about dangerous behaviours, dangerous thought patterns, self-injurious behaviours, things like that, have said, well, whatever helps you, just keep doing it. It's fine. Which, you know, just dissuaded me from then reaching out about anything else ever again, because I was like, they don't care. They clearly think that it's fine. It also reinforced unhealthy thoughts that I was having at the time that were making me think that what I was doing was normal. And those careless words that people say, like, they happen a lot to young people. We don't have control about what spaces we're entering. You know, we have to go to school, we have to put up with people that we don't like. We're forced into a lot of situations that adults get control over. And so we end up with a lot of things said to us that really shouldn't be. You know, I've had people that were in positions of trust, positions where they were, you know, somebody to go to for young people experiencing mental ill health, that have said really damaging things to me at a point in my life where I was really vulnerable to those. You know, I've had people say, like, well, I'm confident that if I just do nothing, you're not going to be in the hospital by tomorrow morning. You know, I've had somebody compliment my self-harm and tell me how good I was at it and how neat it was, which is really not helpful when you're trying to, you know, get a bit more mentally healthy. The final thing that I want to talk about is the transition from youth services to adult services, which I think is really, really important and a massive barrier at the moment to young people getting the support they need. As I've touched on, autonomy in youth services is an issue. And not only does that damage therapeutic relationships and have young people alienated, it also means that young people aren't developing the skills, the support toolkit, or the vocabulary that they need in order to access adult mental health services. Services like CAMS make decisions for you. I was under CAMS doing diagnostic questionnaires without being told what they were for, what the outcome was. You know, I didn't know what my treatment plan was. I didn't know what services I was receiving. So when you're then chucked into self-directed services like adult psychiatric services, it's very difficult for you to say, I've done CBT and I found that really helpful, I'd like to do another course of CBT, when you don't know what you were doing or what it was called. So that really creates a stigma against young people when they're trying to reach out for support, because if they're not engaging the right way and having the right skills to communicate what they need, It's just deemed that if they wanted help, they would have asked for it. If they wanted help, they would have engaged with the service, when a lot of us try to, but we're not able to. And unfortunately, only some people are actually even successful in getting the referral through to adult services. CAMHS, discharged me when I was 17 because they didn't want to treat me when I was leaving to go to uni, even though it was in the same city. So I went from having weekly check-ins with a psychologist and monthly check-ins with a psychiatrist to having absolutely nothing at a time when, I was turning 18, which was a massive trigger point for me. I was moving to uni, a lot was changing in my life, and it just resulted in me absolutely spiraling because the only person that was checking in about my mental health was me. So it got to the point where I was flushing meds, I was really struggling with self-harm, suicide attempts, and there was nobody there for me to go to because I was in between two services that didn't want me. The transition to adulthood is extremely difficult for anybody. It's a time in people's lives when everything is uncertain, everything is up in the air. But if you're dealing with mental health difficulties on top of that, it can feel impossible at times. So that is a point in your life where you need more support and not less. In order to make this transition easier, there needs to either be more autonomy in the youth services towards the end of it, so that you can develop the skills and the vocabulary to enter adult services more successfully, or there needs to be more of an hands-on approach from adult services when you're coming in from youth services, so that they can kind of ease you into what you're going to have to do for yourself. And I also think that it feels a duty of care to young people if they go from, hands-on support from one service to just getting chucked out with no notice for such an arbitrary reason that they're leaving school or they're turning 18.
Ayla, thank you. Thanks so much for sharing that with us. Thank you. We're going to come back to you again in the panel discussion, okay? But that was great. Thanks so much. Sam, are you okay to do your presentation now? We're ready to hear from you, Sam.
Of course. So like my friend Ayla, I also have some experiences to share that I hope will provide, an insight into preventing suicide in young people. So my story, I had a few encounters with social services when I was a kid. I grew up in a very abusive home. I was homeschooled. And I just wanted to share one story in particular. So it was the day before my 16th birthday, I gave my local social services a call, and basically I just told them I need to get out of this house. And they asked why, and I didn't say. I didn't feel like I could. My abuser was upstairs above me, and as a result, my vocabulary was very limited. So they didn't really know what to do with me, so they passed me on. And 3 hours later, I'd been passed around 5 different agencies, and I eventually came back to the same woman who I spoke to in the first place. 3 hours later, I was distraught, and she had put me on a housing register. 6 months waiting list, which was ridiculous. And a week later, I found myself alone in a garden shed with a rope around my neck and just willing myself to finish it. And I couldn't, thankfully. And I just wanted to raise the points that, first of all, I feel agencies, including Childline, who I think were one of the 5 agencies I spoke to that day, failed to notice, which is one, that sometimes the abusee doesn't know that what's happening to them is wrong. So I definitely have Stockholm syndrome. I didn't think what was happening to me was wrong. I just wanted to get out of that situation. And because of that, I didn't want to give any details. All I could tell the people was that something was wrong, not what was wrong, because I didn't want the police to get involved, because I thought, I can't put this guy in trouble. And also to add that a lot of young people, if they grow up in an environment, a family, as we all know, is a very, very controlling, small atmosphere, or can be anyway. And a lifetime of conditioning for me as a child meant a verbal admission that what was going on wasn't normal or wasn't right, was impossible. Like, I came out of the situation a few years ago, and as my eyes were open to how normal families live and how people actually interact with each other. And my second point was that agencies, or these agencies anyway, the people that I spoke to didn't recognize these non-typical signs of trauma and stress. I think people are trained to look for physically in person, say bruises, tremoring voice or shaking or this kind of thing, or fear. Whilst with me and with other children as well, I feel what can happen is you get the emotion beaten out of you. So you speak in a very deadpan way. People used to tell me I was completely emotionless, and inside I would be just terrified or in complete turbulence. And I was so afraid when I was talking to these people, but I think my voice came across as just metallic, and they just thought there's just some weird child on the other end of the line. I don't know what's going on here. And that's basically it. But I also just wanted to raise as well the question of, I wanted to know what agencies are doing actually with children in homeschooling, because when I was a kid, I had a couple of visits from the government, but they never actually checked on me. My abuser just told them, he's got a cold, he's in bed, and they never actually checked on me. And it's kind of a loophole, actually, I think. But I don't know. It's just a few minutes of your time. Thank you.
Sam, that was so courageous. Thank you so much. To both of you. Thank you. It was really powerful. And I hope that you feel heard by people here today. Christina, I'm going to move on now because some of the young people from our YAG couldn't be here today, but they wanted to have their voice heard as well. So we have another young person who had a point that they wanted to make and they wanted people to hear. So if it's okay, Christina's going to take a little minute to share that with you now.
Literally 30 seconds, because I know how tight we are for time, Lynn, but I just really quickly wanted to say thank you to Sam and Isla as well, because obviously they've shared really personal experiences, but we've talked a lot about what they wanted to say today, and I think for both of them it was really important to share their experiences. And for other young people, maybe it's important to share their experiences, but they're not able to share it in person for whatever reason. So just to let you know that there was one other YAG member who really wanted to make the point that when they were in a situation where their mental health was really in a point of crisis, they felt like the thing that people were saying to them most was, you can't do this because think of how much it's going to hurt everybody else. And they really wanted to make that point, that actually what they wanted to hear was that their life was valuable and that they were valuable as a person, not that they would cause other people stress or sadness if they did take their own life. So that was the point that I'm passing on from another YAG member.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you. And I know that those accounts from Isla and Sam were very powerful. And Isla and Sam have lived through those experiences, and they have done so well to actually find their voice and have their voice here today, and to want to be part of this and want to be heard, because we that do research in this area or have worked in this field, and I've done a bit of both. We've heard these accounts, but to actually stand up and bring them into the room, I think is really important, because we're talking about young people and it is all about them. But we are now going to move on to our panel discussion. Okay, so I'm going to ask our panel members to remember their presentations if they can, and remember all those key interesting facts that they shared with us, because we have got lots of questions for you. The first question was actually for Siobhan. Okay, so Siobhan, and so you're for the first presentation, so it only seems fitting, I suppose, that the first question goes to you. And it was a general question, Siobhan. Somebody said that you had mentioned unsafe reporting of suicide, and they wondered if you could explain what you meant by this.
Okay, thank you for the question, a good question, and I've responded to it in the chat as well, but it's really about this idea of copycat deaths and suicide contagion, as academics would call it, and we have now quite a body of evidence spanning over 20 years of research showing that the way suicide is portrayed in the media, the way suicide is discussed, can influence how people behave when they're in that state of crisis. So, for example, if you promote suicide prevention helplines and help seeking and show examples of how people have recovered and sought help and moved beyond those suicidal thoughts, then that increases the number of calls to the helpline, and it promotes hope, and it that helps people get through those times. And then the other side of it is, of course, if you give information about how a person died, if you show particularly visual images of the person who died, and if you connect the suicide death to particular life events, it can lead people to identify with that person who died, and it can influence their thinking in such a way that increases their risk of suicide. Now, suicide is complex, and it's of course about many more factors, but one of the very strongest evidences around, you know, media reporting. So that's something that we would include in all of the strategies. And there's some great guidelines from Samaritans that journalists should follow. And then there's also the Origin Group have the Chat Safe guidelines for young people. When we're talking on social media, you know, it can be very difficult to know how do we discuss these issues, and how do we memorialize someone who's died in a very safe way. So the Origin, ORYGAN, Chat Safe guidelines are great for that. And then look at Samaritan's media guidelines. But thanks for a really good question. You're on mute, Lynn.
That was such an eloquent response as well. Novice. I was just saying thanks for such a great answer, and I wondered if you would put in the chat the link to the Oregon Childlines, or if some guidelines, or if somebody wouldn't mind doing that, because that is something that I think people will find helpful. I'm going to
go. Yeah, sorry.
Thanks, Siobhan. That's okay.
I'll try to do it in the chat.
Cheers. Okay, so there was another question here for Rory. So Rory, if you're okay, this person thanks you for your talk, and they have said that studies suggest that self-harm increases the risk of suicide by 30 times. And with this in mind, do you feel that self-harm, specifically more akin to non-suicidal self-injury in the US and self-harm without suicidal intent, fits into your IMV model?
Yeah, no, so Siobhan and I have both done our...
You've both answered online.
We've both done our homework. So I miss Siobhan, we're on the ball, obviously.
Fab.
But just for those who haven't seen the chat.
Okay.
Yeah, so yes, the short answer is, so in terms of my IMV model, the factor on it is any form of self-harm, suicidal or self-harming behavior increase, because we know the best predictor of any future behavior is past behavior. So it's exactly the same with any form of self-injurious behavior. If you do it once, you're more likely statistically to do it again. And then we've also done it we've investigated the components within the IMV model, for example, within adolescents who self-harm, and that's mostly adolescents engaged in self-cutting without suicidal intent. And again, the model still is, all those key factors I mentioned are still relevant and important.
Okay, thanks, Rory. The next question I'm going to ask is an open question to any of the panelists. So this might be an opportunity for people to come in. And it's a general question. Has anybody's work produced any special considerations for supporting young people in foster care settings? This might include prevention or intervention strategies targeting both youth and caregivers. Has anybody got any particular experience of, Lauren?
Yes, so we work slightly differently with people in young people in care, because with each contact that comes into Childline, we have to do a specific risk assessment on each contact. So that automatically would change for someone that isn't care experienced. So whilst we might not have any kind of, facts and figures for how we deal with that and any trends, we do all handle these situations quite differently. So if a young person's in foster care, unfortunately, that means that our confidentiality promise isn't as ironclad as it might be for someone else, because that foster carer could have access to other young people. So it might be quite tricky in terms of confidentiality, but we also recognise that there's a different level of protective factors as well. It's not all negative in that scenario. So there's an assumption that if a young person's in foster care that they have had those adverse childhood experiences, and that is going to differ in terms of their resilience and their capacity to keep themselves safe. So it's something that we would keep in the back of our minds if we learn that a young person is care experienced over someone who's stayed in the family home. Although there's factors for that all over, because the family home could be a worse place than someone in care, and we need to kind of respect everyone's differences within that.
Thank you, Lauren. Does anybody else want to come in on that point, or shall we move to the next question? That was a good answer. No. Okay. Well, Okay, I was going to ask Jo, have there been any other questions in the chat that you want to bring up? Because I know that people were putting things in more when the young people were talking as well.
Well, there's a couple of questions both in Q&A and chat, I think, around active listening, this idea of active listening. And I think just asking about how accessible training for active listening might be to the wider population. So whether that be, I guess, families and parents, or whether it could be teachers and educational people working in the education sector, I suppose. Does anyone know whether does Childline provide training, external training on active listening? Do any other organisations do that parents could access?
With specifically active listening, I'm not sure if we have something on that, but we do have kind of a wealth of resources on the NSPCC website and how to help young people cope with difficult feelings, and also parenting, and there's a huge library of them there. But where we specifically teach active listening is in our volunteer counsellor training. So if anyone is interested in that, please do get in touch, and you can go through that training process for it. It's about 12 weeks long.
Okay. Thanks. Can I just follow up on that? Thanks, that's helpful, Lauren. But I wondered if I could ask Jenny, what's happening around Scottish Government discussions to support families and parents of young people who might be struggling?
Yeah, so I can talk about other work that I've heard happening. So there is the Mental Health in Schools Working Group, and they have committed to creating 3 different pieces of work, the first of which is online learning resources for professionals. And it basically covers mental health, upskilling anybody in a school with a certain level to understand what mental health looks like and what we need to know. And they've also just produced the Mental Health in Schools Whole School Approach Framework. And they also have on Education Scotland's website committed to putting up good practices. So that's available there, and I can post the links to all of this in the chat. So in terms of education, that's what has come across my desk.
Okay, hi. Christina, you wanted to come in there?
It was just to read out one of the comments from the chat, Lynn, which is from Emma Wilson, which says she recommends some of the active listening training in the mental health first aid, England youth mental health first aid course. So.
That's fab. Thanks, Christina. Yep. I am actually going to come back to our panel members, because we didn't give the opportunity for the panel members to ask Jenny any questions, and we moved on quickly. We didn't ask Rory any questions. So I'm wondering if anybody within the panel had anything that they wanted to say about their presentations. Although Rory actually has his hand raised. So shall we do that first, Rory?
I know, so it's just on the point about resources. So Scottish Government also, in addition to what Jenny said, so if you go to the Clear Your Head website, so which is the Scottish, but it's available anywhere, that there's resources on there about looking after yourself and also on supporting others. And I think there's also within that, or there's definitely on some of the Scottish Government website, you have free access to what are known as this, I think some of the Solihull resources, which again are for support for parents as well. So just that's all available. So if you go to, as a starting point, clearyourhead.scot. Clearyourhead.scot. Sorry, that's all I wanted to say. Sorry, Lynn.
That's okay. Thank you, Rory. It is helpful, and I think that is what people seem to be looking for. And we can certainly share these resources beyond the webinar. You will get an email with probably an evaluation form, and it'll be short, and some follow-on resources and people's contact details and things like that. But if we could just come back to, if anybody had any questions for Rory or Jenny on the panel, then I'd be pleased to take them. Did anybody on the panel have anything they wanted to ask Rory or Jenny? No? Yep, Jo does.
Could I ask Rory a quick question? So, well, thanks to both of you, first of all, for excellent presentation.
No.
I'm going to override you there, Rory, and ask you anyway. So you put up a slide talking about the risk factors which increase the risk of young people acting out on suicidal thoughts. I think it was your second to last slide, do you remember? And it struck me that they were very individual level risk factors. So it's obviously a sort of risk focused model, and very much at the individual level. And so I just wondered if you could flip that round to think about protective factors. So if a young person is experiencing suicidal thoughts, what kind of protective factors can we as family, communities, society put in place to stop that then moving into actual suicidal behaviour?
Well, so well, there's two parts to that. One is, so yeah, most of them, or many of them, were individualistic, but the very first one, access to the means of suicide, that's environmental and certainly not individualistic in that way. So there's definitely stuff at that level. But if your question is, so how can we support young people who are feeling suicidal? I think it's around then in terms of protective factors. It's things like obviously promoting social connectedness, challenging obviously loneliness, increasing one's sense of self-worth. So there's lots can be done there. So you're reducing. So the question to me is always, how do you, anything which reduces entrapment, feeling entrapped, if I can't immediately change the circumstance that's leading the person to feel defeated or humiliated, what can I then do to support them? So that, I mean, and then obviously promoting resilience at a community level. But I think more broadly, in terms of the thing about obviously talking about your mental health problems and campaigns at a public health level, they're all well and good, but then you have to have access to the services. So the challenge, I think, and so for World Suicide Prevention Day, which obviously was last week, at the International Association for Suicide Prevention, when we were thinking about what our theme would be for the next 3 years, we settled upon, after a lot of consultation with all stakeholders across the globe, or lots across the globe, we settled on this idea of creating hope through action. And I suppose then it's anything we can do to create hope. And there's lots of ways we can create hope, which will hopefully alleviate a sense of obviously suicidal distress. And that is at all levels of, as I say, you creating hope by speaking or smiling at somebody in the street type thing, or reaching out or phoning your friend, or whatever it may be, but at the whole level of community and government. And it's then creating hope. So I do come back to this point that our young people have been through a really challenging time where they feel undervalued. They've been thought about last, not relevant first. And now they're the ones in mental health and social and educational and work prospects have the most to lose. So we need, so when the government continues its response, it needs to be proper. This leveling up, carry on, we keep hearing about, level up with young people. That's what I would do.
Thank you, Rory. That's a really good point. We have a question for Isla and Sam, if they feel comfortable enough to answer it. Someone has asked, Isla or Sam, do you have suggestions for key questions or language that people should use when they're talking to young people about self-harm? And they've said this could include ways to open a question or broach the topic, for example. Do either of you want to answer? Sam, you've unmuted.
Yeah. Well, on the spot, I'm sure I could come up with something better if you gave me 5-10 minutes. But on the spot, I would say trying to avoid being too sensitive about it is actually quite good. Like it doesn't help you if someone talks to you about your self-harm, like and how does that make you feel? It's just like, okay, you're hurting yourself, you're cutting yourself, you're burning yourself. What are we going to do about this? Why do you feel like this? It's not. You shouldn't walk around it like I'm some fragile egg which you can crush with your hands easily. I mean, obviously, we're going through something if we're harming ourselves, but at the same time, trying to avoid being patronizing or that kind of thing.
Thanks, Sam.
Yeah.
Thank you. Isla.
Hi. So I think one of the really important things about questions, like when you're speaking to someone who's in that state with their mental health, is that the questions are straightforward, to the point, and they don't, I think it's quite important that we stay away from terms that people can be in denial about. Like, I know that a lot of the time, you know, there's been a significant proportion of my life that I've been suicidal, but if someone asked me, do you have suicidal thoughts or are you suicidal, I would have said no, partly because I didn't know that I was suicidal because of the way that I was always asked. So simple questions like, do you think about dying? There's different ways that you can phrase the questions. And similarly with self-harm, like, do you hurt yourself? Like, the terms, when you use them officially, you know, can be quite stigmatized in themselves. And people tend to think that they're these like big things that only specific people struggle with and kind of distance themselves from them. So asking really like to the point questions with simple language that don't kind of seem like trick questions that someone's gonna like want to like phone your parents as soon as you admit that you're self-harming. Like, you know, just keeping it to the point and destigmatizing it as much as possible is really important.
Thank you, Ayla. Thank you. Does anybody else on the panel have anything they want to add to that in terms of talking to young people about suicide, Siobhan?
From our engagement with young people, actually talking to them and listening to them is what's most important. There's an overemphasis, I think, sometimes in services around assessment and going through questionnaires that our young people talked about this as well. It's completely meaningless in terms of their life. You know, some of the questionnaires that we use to try and measure mental health, mental illness, suicidal distress, because they're designed for different populations, you know, when they talk about, are you able to get up and wash your, you know, brush your teeth in the morning and stuff like that. And it's not the right way to start these conversations. It's just so important to listen to young people, I think, and if in doubt, ask them to tell, you know, stories about what's happening and just getting them to talk about their lives and really understand what's going on for them rather. So the way we try to measure the stuff, I think, is really deeply unhelpful. I know it's important because we want to look at change and we want to try and, you know, we keep records, and but we know that risk assessment really doesn't work anyway. So I think if it's about relationships, making people feel psychologically safe so that they can tell us, and we, you know, and we won't report them to one person or another. Or, you know, that fear of being reported is a huge thing that I'm hearing today, and I hear that a lot as well.
Thank you, Siobhan. There are two participants that have their hands raised, and I think one is Lauren and one is Hazel. Am I right? Yeah.
Yep.
No, Hazel's like, no, it's Joe. Okay, well, I'm going to go to Lauren.
Well, sorry, Lauren has as well, but can I follow up? Because just picking up on the confidentiality issue, there was a question for Isla in the chat, which was from Ailey James, and she said, Isla, I was interested in your observations re confidentiality. How do you think this can be improved? Sometimes confidentiality is broken because staff may feel it is how they can keep the young person safe. Would you have any thoughts about where you could draw the line around information sharing?
So I agree that like safety is like the most important thing. Like, and if there is like a genuine concern about a young person's safety and like bringing somebody else in is going to be beneficial in that, then absolutely that is a good reason to break confidentiality. But I think one of the important things is that whatever a young person can expect in terms of confidentiality needs to be upfront. So don't promise confidentiality if you can't deliver it. If there is a specific reason why you should or would break confidentiality, tell us, because we are going to understand that. Unfortunately, it might impact on what someone tells you, but, you know, they're trying to also protect themselves. I think that it's really important that once that, you know, I just think it's really important that there is honesty about confidentiality, to be honest. You know, there are way too many cases where people are receiving treatment through like a youth service, and, you know, letters are sent to their parents, like detailing and what care they've been receiving, what things they've been saying in sessions. You know, when it's happened with me, confidentiality has been broken for precisely the opposite reason of safety. It's been broken to tell people like that people weren't worried about my mental health and that people didn't think I was a risk to myself. And to me, that just doesn't make any sense. If the reason for breaking confidentiality is safety, that is completely understandable. But if that's the reason, that should be the only reason. And there should be honesty about that.
Thanks, Ayla. Thank you. Lauren, did you still want to come in there as well?
Sure, it was just to go on what the back of what Siobhan was saying as well about how we should be talking to young people about these kind of difficult feelings. And something I think I found really helpful at Childline is actually providing the opportunity to talk about the worst case scenario of, okay, this is what you're worried about. This is what feels overwhelming. It feels like the worst thing that can happen. What if it happens? What will you do? And giving people the chance to explore it in a safe space rather than see it as this completely unachievable, unimaginable goal or pain is to just, that's the kind of comfort that I'm talking about in holding these conversations, that to just explore them, because they might not go perfectly, but it might make people feel prepared for what if the worst happens.
Thank you, Lauren. We only have a couple of minutes left. It has been such a jam-packed discussion this afternoon, and I hope that everybody that's attended has got something out of it. It's also been quite an emotive discussion. I think we'll all agree that, you know, I hope that everyone will do something positive to take care of themselves after this and check in with somebody if they need to. But before we finish, does anybody else on the panel have any kind of last thoughts or comments that they would like to make?
I just had my hand up for some reason. You thought I was Hazel a minute ago. I don't know what happened.
Sorry, Rory. Yeah, people are moving around my screen. In my defence, people's cameras are going on and off, and then people's positions are moving.
I think a bit unfair on Hazel, to be honest. But anyway, no, I think three things came back on what Lauren and Siobhan said. I think it is what certainly from the young people we've spoken to is obviously validation. Being heard, and because so many young people told us they just don't feel heard, and they hate when other people can obviously tell me if I'm wrong, but what they've told us is what older people, and I use these older people, try and tell them why they feel the way they do and how they're feeling, and that's we're not the experts in somebody's feelings. It's the person's, in this case, a young person, so just validating that what they feel is a real feeling, it's real, and then that's once you agree that, it's moving forward. And clearly doing it. The last bit which Lauren said is really, really important is it's scary as heck the first time somebody tells you they're suicidal. But it's been able to be alongside that, because if you respond with fear and trying to shut down the conversation, the next time that young person is not going to open up. So it's really so, and then my very, very last point is if we ask somebody, we're always telling people, ask somebody whether if you think of an event in your life or whatever, if we ask that question the way in which we want the answer to be no, right, the answer will be no. So it's been really, people are not stupid, so we need to be open
to hearing it.
To hear it, and that's it. So that's my last bit.
Absolutely, Rory. Thank you for making those points. Isla?
So I'd like to double back to something that Siobhan said a bit earlier, if that's okay. And it was about like the way that we report on like suicide and death, and I think that that is a really important point, and something that's impacted me quite a lot is the way that we look at kind of statistics and the way that we look at the information that we have. And kind of in my life, I was very impacted by like the statistics of other people with the same like ACEs that I've had and like the same characteristics as me. And because I was already kind of struggling with suicidality and my mental health at that point, that really influenced and solidified a thought in my mind that the only possible route for my life was that I would be in prison, sectioned, or dead by the time I was 18. And I was, once that idea was in my head, I was unable to move on. And I think that part of the issue with that was that the information was delivered to me as part of just like what I was learning at school. It wasn't delivered in a way that was thinking about how do we deliver this information to somebody who is actually affected by these things? How do we deliver like the information about this in a trauma-informed way that thinks, you know, telling someone that 90% of the people that share this characteristic with them do this thing, how do we, you know, deliver that in a way that's not going to make that person think that their only option is to follow that path? So I think that's really important.
Thank you, Isla. And I think it's really important for us to be mindful of that as well in today's webinar, because, you know, for young people and older people alike, you know, we never know what people have been through, the roads they've walked, the shoes they've worn, and where they're at today. So, you know, these have been very hard to hear conversations, but I think important ones to have. And, you know, I really want to thank everybody for being brave enough to make such valuable contributions and to come along and share their work or their personal experiences with us. And please, you know, like to all the participants, get in touch with us. We will share with you afterwards, you know, everyone's contact details and some of the resources that have been shared in the chat. So that's the end of today's webinar. Thank you all.